Wow. So this is amazing stuff, guys. Guys, this is one of the most important interviews I've ever done. Shalom and welcome to Hebrew Voices. I'm here with Dr. Sophia Pitcher, who earned her PhD from the University of the Free State in Bloemfontein, South Africa. She's a research fellow with the University of the Free State, and she works with SIL Global on Bible translations, translating the Bible into languages for the first time. Those who follow the program have heard of Sophia because she has this groundbreaking, I don't know if I want to call it discovery or hypothesis. I'll decide throughout this program. But I don't know, you probably don't know this, Sophia, but I try to do what I call an SBL review, where I get people on to talk about what the best lectures they've heard at SBL are. And multiple people in multiple different years have mentioned your lectures as the best lectures they heard. Maybe because they're just the most innovative, right? Like whether you're right or wrong, I really don't know, but you're raising a question and offering an explanation that it just wasn't satisfactory up until now, and you're offering. So thank you for joining the program, Sophia. We've tried to have this for a while. We've been trying to do this and get together. Before we jump into the Hebrew accents, which, I mean, you are arguably the world's foremost expert on the accents of the biblical accents, let's say, in the biblical text. So it's interesting you're working on translations, because I can see how that ties in. So give us a little bit about your background. You have kind of a really interesting story. When we first interacted, you said you were from Chicago. I said, I'm from Chicago.
Yeah, so that was really neat to see how our stories connect. I grew up in Chicago and south side of Chicago, and I went to school. I later learned that your grandmother was my biblical Hebrew teacher in elementary school. So I went to school at Akiva Schechter in Hyde Park, and that is where I got my first introduction to the Hebrew language and Jewish culture, and the Hebrew Bible in its script and the cantillation marks, all of that. And so that's kind of my introduction to how I got started with all of.
So I apologize for the question, but are you from a Jewish background?
I'm not.
Then how did you end up going to Akiva Schechter? And by the way, so just so people understand, Hyde Park is the area around the University of Chicago. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm a North Sider.
Yeah.
And I know my parents spent part of their years growing up in Hyde Park, and they eventually migrated, like much of the Jewish community, to the North Side. But a lot of Jews stayed there, and so there was a Jewish school all the way on the South Side in Hyde Park. And my grandmother used to drive every day from 7033 North Kedzie all the way down. So like that's probably like, wow, I don't know, over 10 miles. She would drive to her job, I don't know, 5 days a week or whatever, in Hyde Park at Akiva Schechter. So when you said Akiva Schechter, I said, I'm sure my grandmother was your teacher. And you have to understand, like, I'll be having dinner with my sisters and my mother somewhere in Jerusalem, and we'll meet somebody from Chicago, and my grandmother was their Hebrew teacher, right? Like from a certain generation, let's say, right? So like it wasn't that surprising. But so why did your parents send you to Akiva Schechter?
It was a wonderful school, and as Christians, we really value the traditions that are the foundations of our beliefs.
Oh, wow. Okay.
They were excited about me learning Hebrew and learning Jewish culture and just being exposed to all of the things that I had a chance to experience at Akiva Schechter. So yes,
That's amazing. And this is probably something you don't know, but so my grandmother, who was your Hebrew teacher, her let's see, her grandfather, I want to say. So I found these Hebrew newspapers from the late 1800s. They're on the National Library of Israel website, and he's mentioned as leading a Zionist rally in a small town in Lithuania um, in like 1898, right? So there were Jews who were reading Hebrew and writing in Hebrew, and that was part of like this national, essentially Jewish revival in the late 1800s, right? So everybody says, oh, Eliezer ben Yehuda, revived Hebrew. That's kind of true, but it's more complicated. Before Ben Yehuda, there were daily Hebrew newspapers in Eastern Europe. I think there were four of them, or there's four online at the National Library of Israel. So you learning Hebrew is essentially like a descendant of that, right? Meaning that's where my grandmother knew Hebrew, right? She grew up being able to speak and read Hebrew, even though that wasn't her native language, was Yiddish. And then so she was a natural Hebrew teacher. So, all right, so that's the background. So tell us what is this thing with the before we get into and you mentioned cantillation marks, and I was calling them Hebrew accent marks or Tameh Mikra. We'll get into that. That's really the exciting part here. But I'm really fascinating. I didn't know until we just got on that you work with these. You called them minority languages. That you're working to try to translate the Bible into those languages for the first time at SIL.
Yes.
SIL International.
SIL.
SIL. Okay. SIL Global. Oh, that's the difference between like an acronym and what's that other thing called? Like, right? There's acronyms, and then there is, there's things like where you say FBI, right? But you don't say FUBI, right? And I forget what the other term is.
Yeah, I've always heard it as SIL.
Oh, okay, SIL. I know them from the font. So they have a really good, not so much anymore, but in the past they had a really good, before Unicode, I suppose you'd say, they had a really good Greek font for ancient Greek, and they had a good Hebrew font as well with accents. Before Unicode, that was pretty much what you had to use. So now you can use Arial, right, for Hebrew at least. So SIL Global you work with. What is this? What's a minority language? That's interesting. Because I think every language that isn't Chinese, English, or Spanish, right, or French, right, like the big languages and Russian maybe are like the minority languages in a sense, right?
So languages, many countries of the world, most countries of the world have populations who speak multiple languages, and the languages that get the priority in that society are typically referred to as majority languages, and so those are the languages that are broadly spoken, no matter what your ethnicity is. It's their language or their languages that people are educated in, and languages that are used for that are written down, and so they have this kind of cultural and social kind of.
Okay, that's really interesting. So I lived in China for a year, and what I learned there, one statistic I read is there's 258 mutually unintelligible languages, and that doesn't include dialects. We'll talk about dialects in a minute. And so I would meet people from all over, and they would tell me they spoke Mandarin, and they also spoke their local language. And I'm like, oh, so you speak two languages? Oh, no, the local language isn't a real language. Well, what makes it not a real language? Because there's only one language in China, right? So they're like, you foreigners are so silly. You think there's, Mandarin and Cantonese. Cantonese isn't a real language. It's a local language, a local dialect, right? And there's a term in Chinese. I think it's Fun Wen or something. I'm sure it's wrong. It's been over 10 years. But there's like a term in Chinese for local dialect. And now some local dialects are Sino-Tibetan languages, right? So they really are related to Mandarin, which was the language of the capital in Beijing. And then there's so in their mind, and there's other ones that are not Sino-Tibetan, so they have nothing to do with Chinese. They happen to be some, tribe or nation that was conquered by the Chinese Empire, back in the days of the Ming or the Qing or somebody, and so they're now been swallowed up by China. And so in their mind, their language isn't a real language. So that's what you're talking about. And the crazy thing is there's local dialects that have, like for example, what are they called again? The ones in Western China. They have 80 million speakers, like some of these local dialects, right? local dialects, right? That aren't real languages, which is much more than Hebrew. So give us some examples of I know you mentioned to me you're working with teams of some of these. So now I understand what a minority language is. What are some minority languages that, just to give us an idea, or countries where they have these minority languages?
So one of the languages the language that I'm involved in now working with is South African Sign Language.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
in South Africa, uh, not too long ago, about 2 years ago, um, South African Sign Language became the 12th official language
Oh,
of,
really?
yes. And so,
Wait,
um,
so when they sing the national anthem in the past, they had 11 different languages, right? What do they do now when they sing the national anthem for sign language?
I don't know how South African Sign
Like,
Language.
I've been told that there's no South African who understands the entire national anthem. Maybe like maybe they learn a few words, right? But they don't know the language, all 11 languages, right? Most people, I'm told, know like maybe two or three or four languages.
Yeah, I can't speak to that, but yes, it's
Okay.
I don't know. So one of the things I think that is really important about, for example, having a language recognized
Mm,
is there are constitutional rights that come along with that recognition, and an important one is being able to have your first years of schooling in that language, and
okay.
I'm not sure how South Africa is doing on fulfilling that or providing that for children, but it's really important for children to be able to learn in the language that they use every day and speak every.
Mm.
So
How
yeah,
could you do if you were so like I assume someone who speaks sign language is deaf? Is that safe to
yes,
assume?
absolutely,
So
yeah.
so they would have to have their schooling in sign language, wouldn't they? I mean,
Well, that is a,
I would think.
whole, there's a there's a lot that goes with that. Not all deaf education has not been um, done that way
Mm,
historically necessarily, and so deaf children are not have not been encouraged, always allowed to
mm,
use sign language, their sign
really?
language in school, and they try to get the deaf children sometimes to vocalize and to learn to to lip
I
read,
see.
all kinds of um,
So I have an interesting question. It's totally like I didn't think we'd talk about any of this, but this is fat. But we're gonna get to the accents, right?
okay.
But so my question is, well, I guess I have a few questions. One is, so if you're so is there one South African sign language or are there 11?
So language, as you know, and you kind of alluded to this in your description of what people consider languages and what's
Mm,
official, and it's really it has a lot to do with politics and social connections, and as you know, South Africa, there's apartheid in South Africa, and so the communities were separated. So deaf schools were separated by race, and so I would say now, since the end of apartheid, and people are coming together, and I think people are making a conscious decision to say we have one South African Sign Language, uh,
wow.
and so I would say there are you know likely different communities will use different signs for particular words, um,
Mm,
but when they come together, they can understand each other. They've seen these
wow,
signs.
that's really cool.
So yeah, it's I would say it has more to do with um, a decision to say we are
Mm,
a united deaf community,
mhm,
uh, and we are together going to develop our language and use our
mhm.
language together. Yeah.
So that brings me into another question statement, I don't know, discussion.
Mhm.
Um, so So one of the things I'll encounter from people, especially like, people online, is they'll say, well, originally Hebrew didn't have vowels. Um, and my response to that is, well, the vowels might not have been written down, but every language by definition has to have vowels and vowels and consonants, with one possible exception, which is sign language. So that's a question I actually don't know the answer. I think they actually do have vowels. Like they spell out words, don't they? I mean, maybe they're not really vowels, right? Like if they spell out words from spoken speech, and then how does that work with South African Sign Language, where the word in, Xhosa might be different than the word in Zulu or something, right? So how do they spell out a word, or do they do that? I don't know.
So, you know, probably a lot of that is coming from interacting with
Mhm.
hearing people. But I would imagine when deaf people are together, they're not they're
They're
signing.
not spelling. Oh, really? But so let me ask this. I mean, and I guess again, I don't know the answer here. So are the people who are learning South African Sign Language learning to read also a particular spoken language, if you can call a written language spoken? And that ties into the accents we'll get to, the biblical
So,
accents.
I really don't know a lot about what deaf education has looked like
Hmm.
for children in South Africa. But um, as you can imagine, learning
Hmm.
to read is in, let's say, in English or any other language.
Yeah.
Deaf is, and we're born deaf, is a really uh, difficult is a difficult
I never thought about that, but that makes a lot of sense.
yeah. So
That's really interesting.
part of
I didn't think about that.
reading easy for hearing speakers is because um the symbols
Wow.
um
Mhm.
are we've heard the words that are being represented on the page, and we have
Mhm.
a way to connect the sounds that we're hearing to these words on the page,
Wow.
and that process uh, develops a long time before you even begin to
Mhm.
read. And so if a deaf person has never heard these sounds, connecting them to the written word is not easy. Um,
Wow. So
and
what you're telling me, I never thought about that. So every deaf person, maybe not every, but anybody who's born deaf, I guess we have to say, um, who's reading a written language is essentially reading a foreign language.
absolutely, Ab-
Wow. And
absolutely.
that's why the translation, because I'm thinking, why do we need it translated into sign language if it's already written in, I don't know, English or Zulu or whatever the Bible is? So you just answered the question. What? So how do you translate it? Does it have to be in video format? I mean, maybe it's.
Yes, yes, it's in video format.
Oh wow, that's so cool.
And you can see some of these. You can see these these video Bibles on Deaf Bible Society. They have an app, and um,
Oh wow.
constantly uploading um, translations that are being
Oh,
completed.
that's so cool. All right, that's really cool.
It really
Um, all right, so now that actually has a relation to so basically, like when I said, every language has vowels and accents, or not vowels and accents. So you'll talk about that. Every language has vowels and consonants, with the exception possibly of sign languages. So you're essentially confirming that in a way, meaning like if it does, it's essentially reproducing something from the spoken language. It's not really native in a way to the sign language.
right. And sign languages are natural languages. They have syntax and grammar and phonology, and they have all of those things. They have all of the morphology. They have all of the structures of any language. It just looks different.
So we're talking about sign languages, and that I think is a great transition now to go into the accents in biblical Hebrew. Um, so our biblical texts, and like I said, there's people who say that Hebrew originally didn't have vowels or accents, and so what I think we can say as scholars is they weren't written down, but it had vowels, right? In other words, when Isaiah was first written down, whoever wrote, Ko Amal, he knew how to pronounce that. Now, maybe he didn't pronounce it the way I do, but he pronounced it in some way, or she pronounced it in some way or another. So, what are the accents? What are the cantillation marks in the Bible?
So I've moved away from calling them cantillation marks
Oh,
because
okay.
I don't. Cantillation um, is something that I don't really understand what it is in terms of it's how it relates to linguistics, how it relates to is it song, is it speech, is
Mm-hmm.
it something in between, and
So for the audience who doesn't know, calling them, or let's start with this. The accents are these little symbols that when they read the Torah in the synagogue, they are in a sense chanting it, cantillating it. Neither of those terms are perfect. There's a stylized way of reproducing each of these symbols and applying it to a syllable. And then each Jewish community may have a different way of doing that. So, all right. And so what's the term that you prefer for these
well,
symbols?
I call them Masoretic accents, Tame Hamikra.
Okay.
But essentially, what we know is that it's it's a dimension of the language, and
Mhm.
that is on par with the vowels and the consonants. And
Mm.
so I don't like to use the term. I don't use it. I'm pushing against
Okay. So accents, we can call them that.
cantillation because that's not well defined,
Okay.
and music. That's something that I'm also pushing against. That I think
Mm.
uh, the way that we consider, or maybe some communities maybe consider the cantillation or the Masoretic accents, the sounds, the phenomena of the accents as music, I think is because we haven't really understood, we haven't had a framework to understand what this dimension of language is that comes with the vowels and the consonants that you can't separate from the spoken word, the text,
Mhm.
and so music, I think, doesn't describe it. Melody, but it's partly because we haven't had a way to understand it, to deal with it, to connect
Mhm.
it to the spoken, the uttered.
And I'll have the editor throw up on the screen a page here from the Aleppo Codex. So here is there's really four sets of symbols on this page. We have the letters, or we sometimes call them consonants, but really letters, because some of them are vowels, like the chola, the chola malay, the vav, and used as a vowel. We have letters. We have vowel points, and even that's not a great perfect term because dagesh isn't a vowel. Um, we have accent marks, which is what we're going to talk about, and then we have the Masoretic notes, which is for a separate discussion. So these accent marks, or what I call it, you call Masoretic. Why Masoretic? Tell us what that means?
Because the Masoretes, they
Mhm.
are scribal scholars, who medieval scribal scholars who preserved, who innovated the notation, the system of notation that we call the accents or the accentual system or the Tame Hamikra. They innovated them, and so
Can
that's
you explain the term ta'ameh mikra for, let's say, who those who do?
so Ta'ame Hamikra, literally the tastes of the reading.
Isn't that interesting that it means taste?
Yes, yes. So the way it's understood, described in the literature, is that it provides the sense, the meaning. It gives a flavor to what is said. So there's a layer, there's a dimension of the spoken word that kind of that shapes the meaning of what is said. The reading, of course, is the reading of the Hebrew scriptures, and it's interesting again. These words like mikra, they're not, that's a reading. It's not a song. It's not music. It's these are speech related speech related phenomena.
So it's interesting. In English, we'll say scripture, but the Hebrew word mikra, literally, which is the word for Bible, let's say, or the Hebrew Bible, is literally means that which is read. So that's what, meaning it's something oral in a sense, not in a sense. It's something which is, well, I guess you're reading it, but you're reading it out loud.
Yes, and
so
see
that's the important part.
That's something else that you have to kind of do a shift with modern audiences, because of course when we are, our first sense of reading is typically silent reading. That we don't necessarily, when we read, we don't necessarily think about reading to other people and reading publicly and out loud and things like that. So,
and my understanding is that silent reading is a relatively modern, like maybe early modern kind of thing.
Mine too, right.
So when it talks about meditate upon the Torah day and night, it has the word Haggah, which is to sort of recite, or it's the sound that a dove makes, right? It's an oral thing. It's something that's verbalized.
Yes.
So all right, so we have these accent marks. So let's start with what is the classic, and here's where you think I bring some really important things to the table. What is the classic explanation? Because I wasn't taught this was the classic explanation at Hebrew University. I was taught this was the explanation. And you're just saying, okay, that's a hypothesis. What's the classic explanation of these accent marks?
So I understand the accent marks to that in the literature they're kind of separated. So the features of the accents are separated. We know that their kind of primary feature is this melody feature that comes along with it, that is typically separated from how it actually functions in the text. So the melody is set aside as kind of the music or the chanting, something else. But then we have these essentially two types of accent marks. And one are conjunctives and one are disjunctives. And so they essentially connect words to each other or separate them from one another. And and the separating function is typically the most important function in terms of how the accent system is studied, and the separating function is attributed to pause. So my understanding of pause is the lack of sound, a stop, an interruption of the spoken word, and so there's a pausal break, a stop, and then you have a set of the disjunctives that have a different values of breaks. Essentially, some are stronger breaks, some are less strong breaks, and so they form this. They continually divide a verse. These breaks divide the verse into smaller and smaller sections until you can't kind of separate break down the verse any further. And they're typically words that are syntactically closer should be grouped together, that are syntactically related, are usually grouped together and have breaks after them. So that's the disjunctives introduce pause into the text.
So just to give an example for the audience, if we have the phrase Torat Moshe, the Torah of Moses, the word Torat will have a conjunctive accent on it that connects it to the next word. And then Moshe will, well, it depends whatever comes after. It may have a conjunctive connecting it to something else, or it may have a disjunctive if there's a pause there. So you've talked about in your lectures that I've heard the law of continuous dichotomy, which is LCD. Is that law?
Law of
What?
continuity.
Yeah. Or so is that the acronym LCD that you use?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So tell us, what is the law of continuous dichotomy, and who either discovered it or made it up, which is a big difference.
So Wicks, William Wicks,
Mhm.
19th century English scholar, formalized this description of how the accents divide a verse. And so basically the verse is divided in half, essentially, like I said, divided in half, and then divided again until the verse can no longer be divided. And typically, it's divided into um, groups of two. So you'll commonly have in one phrase two words, um, and so it's this, you're constantly dividing a portion in two. So the first half comes, and then you take that half and you divide that half, and then you take that quarter and you divide that half until you can't, and until there's nothing left to divide. Um,
So it goes into halves and then quarters and then eighths and then sixteenths and 32s. And then I think we have some verses like in Numbers where it's into 64ths, where it's like a really, really long verse. Um, and so that's the law of continuous dichotomy, that it continually gets, and you can't have more than two words without that being a unit, although word is defined a little bit differently than maybe we would define it. Like if you can sometimes have really small words that are attached with makaf, which with a hyphen, so that's treated as one word for the purpose of the accents. But under that definition, you really can't have more than two words. I mean, if there's three words, there has to be a division there, or three word units, maybe you want to call them. So that's a law. So it's William Wicks. I'm actually going to show here the audience, so they can actually view this book. And this is significant. I'm going to share my screen here, and you can see it too. So here it's on archive.org. William Wicks published this book in 1887, Oxford, at the Clarendon Press. And what's really significant for me about this is that here you on the opening page, he has a photo from the Aleppo Codex. It says facsimile of a page of the Codex assigned to Ben Asher in Aleppo, and that's what we call today the Aleppo Codex. At the time he published this, that was still at the synagogue, the Jewish synagogue of, I think it was called the Cave of Eliyahu, the Cave of Elijah in Aleppo, and in 1947. That synagogue was ransacked on November 29th when the United Nations declared the partition plan between a Jewish state and an Arab state in Palestine. And the Arabs of Aleppo ransacked the synagogue, and a third of the manuscript went missing. Some people say it was burned. Maybe it's in somebody's private hands somewhere. We don't know. That page is missing. And our only documentation of that page is William Wicks's book, which is pretty amazing. So, all right. So William Wicks comes up with this law of continuous dichotomy. I guess he publishes it in 1887. He has a second volume, or I don't remember which is the second volume. He has the what?
First one was 81. So this one is the second one.
Okay. So this is a reprint from 1970. This is 1881, this one. Okay, there it is. First published 1881. So this is on the three books, the books of Emet, or Tamei Emet, the three so-called poetical books. So say something about the difference between the three books, which and the 21 books, right? We count the books in the Hebrew Bible as 24, which is I would call it a typological number, right? I mean, there aren't actually 24, right? Because the 12 minor prophets are counted as one book. but they're 12 books. So what are these two different? Why are there two different books, and why does Wix have two different volumes for this?
So they're essentially two distinct orthographies to what look like to be two separate systems, although there are lots of overlap in terms of the symbols that are used in each.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I don't think we understand why there are two, other than likely there's a difference in how they sound. But the books, the three books, are largely or been called the poetic books, although there's poetry and there's poetry and prose in each of those. But the set of symbols is typically used in Job, Proverbs, and Psalms for the three books. Set of separate symbols, and for the 21 another set.
So there's two different types of accent marks, one for these three books and then the rest for the other system for the other 21 books, which is interesting because if you go to, let's say, an Ashkenazi synagogue, which I can speak about because I have more experience there, and you hear them recite the Torah using the accents of the 21 books, and then you hear them recite the Haftarah section, which is the prophets portion, they're using the same symbol, but they're implementing them differently. And then they recite the Book of Lamentations, let's say, with the same system they used for the Torah and the prophets. And there's a third way of reciting it for Lamentations, right? So the musical, let's say, quality of that 21 book system is performed in a different way, at least by Ashkenazi Jews. I'm not sure if that's the case in all the communities. And then where it really gets creative is each one of the so-called five scrolls, Lamentations and Ruth, Ecclesiastes, Esther, and help me out here, whatever the fifth one, did I say Ruth? Whatever the fifth one is. Those each one have their own way of performing those musically or cantillating them, even though linguistically it seems almost ludicrous to say that they were different, right? I mean, they're the same set of symbols used, as far as I know, in the same way. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So the musical implementations must have evolved later.
Well,
Just from that, I think.
I mean, I'm certainly making a distinction in my work
Mm-hmm.
to separate that out. The way the symbols are realized in communities today, the traditions that we have recorded, that's separate from
Mm-hmm.
because what we're analyzing in the text.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think any community is saying this is the way the Masoretes were. This is the way the Masoretes, what it sounded like when the Masoretes wrote them down. I don't think anyone has a claim to that or is saying that that's.
Oh, I think let's put it this way. I've spoken to people who would go further than that and say this is how Moses recited the book of Numbers, right? Which, okay. So, all right. So that's an opinion, right? What is the scholarly opinion about, you basically said it. You're saying the Masoretes, when they recorded these graphic symbols, they didn't necessarily perform those symbols the way that they're performed in any particular synagogue today. That's what you're saying.
That right. Yes, that is.
And I don't think that's particularly controversial. So what were the Masoretes? So here's two questions. Did the Masoretes make up they made up the graphic symbols, right? But did they make up did they make up such a thing as an etnachta, right? Which is where each verse is, according to the law of continuous dichotomy, divided in half. Or was there something they heard where they said, oh, that's a rest, which is what etnachta means?
So my understanding, the hypothesis that I'm developing.
Okay, everybody pay attention. We've heard this now in multiple episodes. Now you're hearing it from the woman who has come up with this hypothesis.
So and actually this is, I think, this is not something that I'm saying, that
Okay.
that the accents, the phenomena, the phonology, I'm calling it the phonology, that
What do you mean by phonology?
the
Tell us what that
sound
means.
system, the sound
The
system.
sound. Okay.
So,
The
like
way something sounds.
the way something sounds. So, um, it's the reading tradition that we have,
Hmm.
Tiberian Hebrew reading tradition, that is kind of encapsulated in uh, the vowel pointings and the accentual system. That is not something that the Masoretes made up. That is something that was passed down generation after generation, and can actually be the reading tradition is understood to be Second Temple era. So going back to Second Temple era, that is the scholarly opinion today. And
Okay, hold on. So I'm gonna say something hypothetical here. So when Jesus was in the synagogue, and you don't know, you don't have a time machine, right? But when Jesus was in the synagogue in Nazareth, and he opened up the scroll of Isaiah and he read, was he reading it, or could he have been reading it? Is it plausible to say he was reading it using this accentuation system?
yes, I think that's along with the vowel, along with the sound system for how to pronounce the word. Like, it came with the pronunciation
Mm.
of the word. Um, that's a part of the reading tradition. Yes.
And so how did they transmit this from the Second Temple period all the way down to when the Masoretes wrote it down, which we don't really know when that is, but it was written down by the beginning of the 10th century, probably by the 9th century, but maybe they wrote it down before that. How did was it transmitted?
Orally, it was like you learn how to say this from uh, the people who teach you, your the teachers and in your communities. It's passed down. It's something that um, you learn. That's a part of the the liturgy, in reading the scriptures.
So I want to try to. Well, I'm going to ask you if this is a correct way of explaining this.
Yeah.
So I was once talking to this guy from Italy. I was on this kibbutz, and there was this Jew from Italy there, and he would every time he would, when he was speaking English, he would say, "That's so amazing," and he would say it in this really exaggerated way. And I thought at first he was like making fun of me, and then I realized, you know what? That is how we say that, right? He's exaggerating it because he's not a native speaker, but we don't say that is so amazing, right? Even though, like my grandmother, Ruth Claverson, she used to tell me, Nehemia, enunciate, right? So because English wasn't her native language, so so for her, you could say that is so amazing, like in theory, but in reality, that's not how you say it, right? There's a certain intonation. I also noticed this in China. I was at a dentist office and I said, "Is this going to hurt?" And he said, "Yes." And I'm like, "Wait, did I hear you right?" No, when you tell someone it's going to hurt, you say yes. That's how you say it. And oh, it hurt. He did some treatment without anesthesia. And when I asked for anesthesia, he said, "You can bear it," which I could, but I didn't want to. Anyway, so the point is that what these accents are? Are there certain ways that people express language that we don't think about because we're native speakers? Is that what it is?
So yes. So my hypothesis is
Yeah.
that dimension of language is the dimension of language that we call prosodic phonology. So
Okay.
it's the
Let's put those words up on the screen. Prosodic phonology. And those are scary words. They're scary to scholars, I'll tell you that. Prosodics who aren't linguists. Yeah.
so it's the way that it's the features, it's the sound features that help us to organize the speech, organize our speech, and to
Mhm.
shape it. And like you said, we don't speak in this monotone, flat way. Our speech has um, highs and lows, rises and falls. It has accents. It has um, phrasing. We group things together. So this is the, we call it post lexical. So it's above the lexeme. It's
And
sound.
what's a lexeme?
Lexeme is the word. So for languages that are not tonal, that don't have tonal contrasts, like Mandarin, for example, that can distinguish two the meaning of two words with a different tone. That this is above that. It's melody that that comes with the spoken word, that shapes the spoken the spoken word, and it's just a part of how we say. So word, for example, like Chicago. So Chicago, there's a shape to that word. There's accent on the second Chicago, and then fall, high, fall. Um, Waterloo, Waterloo. So that's a 3-syllable
So,
word.
so isn't it Waterloo?
Okay, Waterloo.
No,
Okay.
I don't. Maybe I'm
Well,
mispronouncing it.
well,
I don't know.
well. Okay, there you go. So that's, and this is regional. So where you're from, right?
And by
Um,
the way, I say Chicago, and we're from the same city, and you say Chicago.
okay. There you. So, but that is the dimension
But
of
neither of us says Chicago or Chicago or Chicago.
exactly.
Right? So you're saying, okay, so there's a you call it a shape.
There is
Okay.
there is there is a melody to
Mm-hmm.
um, high, low, rising, falling. There's stress. Where do we put that melody? Um, and and we're talking about here just a single word, but we could do it. We could take a sentence and see the different ways that we could shape that sentence. But all of that is above the word itself. It's
Mm-hmm.
due um, when we bring words together, and when the word is said in isolation, again, it's said with a contour, um, because that's how we speak. It's a dimension of language that is a part of how we speak.
So I saw this video a while back, and it was this British speech coach, like in the 50s or something, and he was explaining to this immigrant who was a native Tamil speaker from, I suppose, India or Sri Lanka. I don't really know. And he would and he and I'm asking here really if this is what we're talking about. So he explained that the Tamil speech pattern doesn't really have emphasis on different words. The way he said, he gave like he lives in the house that Jack built, and he says the way a Tamil speaker would speak it is he lives in the house that Jack built. Like to us, it almost sounds monotone, but that's their speech pattern. And I've heard this, by the way, about the former vice president who ran for president, that in the native Tamil language, which her name comes from, it's actually not Kamala or Kamala, it's Kamala,
Mm.
with a slight emphasis on the end. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing it, right? Meaning, like, so each language kind of has its own language patterns. And the surefire sign that you can identify a foreigner or a non native speaker is there. I'm speaking English, but I'm speaking Spanish, but I'm using the English intonation patterns, and immediately I can pronounce every word perfectly, but I sound like a foreigner, or I certainly in Hebrew.
That's absolutely true. It's the hardest thing. It's usually one of the last things you learn when you're learning language, and it's the first tip off that usually that you can tell that you're not a native speaker, or
Hmm.
a foreigner in some way, or you're not from around here, or
Well,
that's
that's another interesting thing. Within the United States, we have different prosodic phonologies. Is that the correct way of saying it?
we have different. Well, that's
Like a Southerner doesn't. I don't think necessarily sounds like somebody from Chicago. Am I wrong about that?
so. So, for example,
With a classic Southern accent, right? Not the.
So we'll talk about in the prosodic phonology literature. We'll talk about mainstream American English. Okay.
Okay.
Um, and or British English. And so you when you're describing this level of sound for it's really for a community of speakers, and you would need to study that community of speakers to see
Mm.
what are the differences, what are the qualitative differences between, let's say, a Southern dialect and a Northern dialect or East Coast dialect or something like that. So are they, is it, are there really contrastive differences, or what are those differences and how we would describe that? And that's in the theory, that's kind of deep in the weeds, but
Well, I'll give an example from my family life. So my wife's name, and by the way, my wife sends her regards. So her name is Linnell, and her mother calls her Linail, and her aunt, and this is really interesting. So her mother's sister calls her Linail, and her mother makes fun of her own sister because, because they grew up in different parts of South Carolina, because there's an age gap there, and in other words, when they're making fun, in a sense, they're perceiving the different prosodic phonology and realizing its novelty or its difference. That's I think essentially like when the guy said to me, it's so amazing, right? He doesn't know how to he's not a linguist, he doesn't know how to put it in linguistic terms, but he's hearing something that he's like, why are you saying it that way? Right? That's not how I say it, right? That's really what it means, making fun of someone.
so and in terms of like how you analyze the stream, uh, how you analyze it. So there,
What does stream mean? Stream of
the
what?
stream of speech, the stream of speech.
Okay.
So one of the difficulties that linguists faced is how do you what's the contrastive difference? So there's a phonetic quality and there's a phonemic quality, and so what's really important in terms of the description, in terms of understanding the phonology of the language, is identifying these phonemic differences that.
Can you explain phonemic and phonetic? I think most
So
people don't know what
phonemic,
that is.
for example, with the letter, the difference between b and d.
Okay.
So that's a phonemic difference. Um, so if I say uh, bog and dog, I need to understand the BD distinction to differentiate those two words. Whereas aspiration may not be phonemic. It's a phonetic. It's something that we
What is aspiration?
when you hear the when you hear the sound of
Mm-hmm.
the breath after a stop, um, as opposed to no breath, or the difference between b and v in Hebrew. There, that's not a phonemic difference. It's a phonetic difference, and so it's.
I mean, it can be if it's a vav versus a bet, but
Oh,
if
okay,
it's
right,
if
right,
it's two
right,
performances of the letter bet, so like we have the word kelev dog, but
right.
then my dog, or let's say my dog is kalbi, right? So it's a v in dog, but in my dog it's b. So you're saying that is a phonetic difference that doesn't have a phonemic significance.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
So being able to, what's important for phonologists is to understand what that contrastive difference is, because
Mm.
that's where the meaning um, the meaning lies. So I can say, your wife's family members may say your wife's name differently, but they all know the words that they've said.
Mm.
No one's confused about what they're hearing. There's some phonetic
So
difference,
what would be an example where there is a phonemic difference?
a phonemic difference.
Yeah, phonemic difference.
Um, so um, bag tag. So
Okay.
I have to understand. if my language doesn't have a difference between the b and the t, I'm not going to hear that as phonemically different. But if I do, I'm going to hear B,
So,
T.
so famously, this is something with people, particularly from southeastern China, from Guangdong, where they don't distinguish between l and r.
Mhm.
And so the example I remember when I was a kid is we had this plumber, and he told my mother there was lust in the pipes, and because he can't hear the difference between lust and rust, right? That's those aren't different sounds to him. That's not everywhere in China. I learned
Mhm.
where I lived in China, there was no difference between f and h,
Mhm.
right? So Hua Mulan, right, that character in the movie, they called her Fa Mulan. Where I came, I'm sure I'm doing the tones wrong. I know I am, but the fa, so the tones were more important to them than the difference between fa and h, which like blows my mind, right? So what would be an example where there's a phonemic difference in regards to prosodic phonology? That's I think what we want to understand, right? Because that's ultimately like, why bother to? I understand why the people who are reading the accents generation after generation and they're memorizing it. I mean, not reading the accents; they're reading the Bible, and with every word in that Bible, what's being transmitted, you're saying. And this isn't your opinion. This is a pretty widely accepted thing today among scholars. Jeffrey Kahn is a whole school of thought where this is that goes back to Second Temple times, that meaning in the sometime in the Second Temple, they're learning to recite the whole Bible, and or maybe different people do different portions of it. And when they're saying, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, they're not just pronouncing Bereshit bara Elohim. They're doing it together with some kind of prosodic phonology, as you call it, which then the Masoretes decide we need to write not just down the vowels, but the prosodic phonology. Why would that be important? Why would they go through such trouble? And it is a lot of trouble. The accents are a huge amount of trouble. Wow. So this is amazing stuff, guys. Guys, this is one of the most important interviews I've ever done. You'll probably need to listen to it 2 or 3 times. I know I will. But this is cutting edge stuff. This is really important. I really appreciate you taking the time and coming on the program to explain this. And you're explaining really complicated stuff. Guys, if you're listening to this and you're saying, I have no idea what she's talking about, and if you get 10% of what she's talking about, you are ahead, quite frankly, of most Bible scholars who haven't even heard it, let alone had a chance to understand it. So this is really important. I'm a big believer that we should do our academic work, but we should also try to communicate that to the public. Because otherwise, what are we doing it for? Just for ourselves? So I appreciate you coming on and explaining what you've explained and taking the time and in a sense really putting yourself out here, because some of the things you're explaining haven't been published yet because the editors, quite frankly, this is me saying it, not Sophia. Quite frankly, maybe some of the editors of the journals don't understand what you're talking about because they're not linguists. And I think of one article that you have that did come out in a linguistic journal. Well, that's not an accident, right? Because you needed someone on the staff there who is a linguist to really be able to vet this. So thank you for sharing this.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I have my first linguistics conference actually in May.
Yeah.
So that
Okay.
I'll be sharing this with prosodic phonologists at a tone and
Oh,
intone
wow.
conference. So yeah, it's my challenge there will be to
Well, they
describe
don't know Hebrew, so they'll have no idea if what you're saying is correct or
and
not.
this medieval orthography, explaining that, and so
Right.
it's a challenge on both sides.
Yeah.
Introducing the
So
orthography.
what you're doing really here is interdisciplinary, and that's the one word. That's the problem. Everybody in academia says we should do interdisciplinary stuff. Yeah, but it's hard.
It's very hard. Yes, it's very,
Yeah.
very, very hard.
I've done some interdisciplinary stuff with X-ray fluorescence, studying inks, and I'll try to explain it to people in the field, and well, I need to just understand it myself, and
Right.
and it's a challenge. Well, what questions are the physicists able to even answer? Okay,
Mm.
if they can't answer that question, why I need to reformulate the question. So It's hard. It is, but I think it's really important.
Hard and slow work, but
Yep.
very important work. So,
Well, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
You have been listening to Hebrew Voices with Nehemia Gordon. Thank you for supporting Nehemia's McCore Hebrew Foundation. Learn more at nehemiaswall.com.